This episode is powered by Fuse Energy. And Fuse, Rory, they are at it again. They've got another giveaway for anyone who switches their electricity at getfuse.com/politics and uses the referral code politics.
5 lucky switchers will win a copy of our books, Alastair, and we'll even sign them with a personal message too.
And that means if you've got children, we can do children's books. And if you've got adults, you want an adult's book, we do adult's book. And this is a great time to think about changing your electricity supplier to Fuse, because as of October the 1st, the energy price cap has gone up again. Average annual bill up 10%.
And Fuse's tariffs are cheaper than any of the big 6 competitors. So hopefully you'll be able to save on your electricity bill this winter if you switch. So go to getfuse.com/politics now to find out all the details.
And Fuse are a green electricity supplier. They generate power from their own solar and wind farms. They invest 100% of profits into building more renewables. So they really are trying to make a difference for the planet.
So download the Fuse app now and crucially use the referral code politics after signing up for a chance to win our books. Deadline for entry is 3rd November. Visit getfuse.com/politics to learn more.
It takes just 3 minutes to download the app and sign up, and Fuse will handle everything with your old electricity supplier for you. That's getfuse.com/politics. Welcome to The Rest is Politics with me, Alastair Campbell.
And with me, Rory Stewart.
In common with many, many, many people involved in political and news podcasts, we're going to talk about October the 7th, 1 year on. I think with a particular focus maybe on the role of Iran, which is especially interesting right now. And then for the second half of the podcast, we're going to talk about Labour post-Sue Gray, Morgan McSweeney, all the moves that have been going on. And maybe also about the Tory leadership contest and a very, very interesting finding that we came across in Brighton when, with several thousand people at the first of our Rest is Politics tour, we asked them who they thought should be the Conservative Party leader. And I think we were both very surprised. But let's talk about that in the second half.
So we're recording a year after October the 7th, and we are about to talk about something which is so raw and so sensitive that it almost feels inappropriate. We are not Israelis. We are not Palestinians. I'm going to go on to ask questions which are going to be very offensive to people. I'm going to ask, really, what kind of threat does Hamas or Iran actually pose to Israel? I'm going to ask, what exactly is the Iranian regime up to? But so let me just try to say before I say that, in no way am I minimizing the incredible horror of what happened. I mean, and the problem with this is it feels like me criticizing Iraq or Afghanistan after 9/11. Just for the record, Hamas mounted a horrifying terrorist attack. It killed 1,200 Israelis, many of them at a music festival. It abducted 250 hostages. And in the months since, the attacks on Gaza are often rounded up to over 40,000 people. But if we're getting into the numbers, at the moment it stands at 41,788 Palestinians killed. Gaza smashed to pieces. We've now had hundreds of people killed in Lebanon. And at the heart of this is, it's all very well you and me chatting, but we're analyzing such trauma that Israelis who are absolutely absorbed and bathed in the horror of what happened on October the 7th and quite understandably feel that people should be showing sympathy and speaking up for the horror of what happened, and Palestinians who are bathed in the horror of what's been happening in Gaza and the incredible number, as you often point out, of women and children being killed on a daily basis, are not going to want to listen to some sort of geostrategic argument about what realistically the threat to Israel might be or what the options are, because these things are just bound up in trauma. But that's really finding ways of talking about what happened a year ago and what's happened since. But at the same time, the whole world's shifting. And before I turn back to you, I think probably the most dramatic moment for me in kind of big terms is this announcement just recently that Israel has declared the Secretary General of the United Nations persona non grata. And what that sort of symbolizes. And it's a very interesting moment for what that suggests about international global order, the way in which democracies think about each other in the UN, the way in which the international community does or doesn't get involved in these kinds of conflicts, because my instinct is that it would have been very difficult to imagine something on quite this scale happening 20 years ago without a much, much more determined intervention by the US, the UK, and France to try to bring peace, bring a ceasefire much more rapidly. Anyway, over to you.
I mean, you're right that it is extraordinarily difficult to talk about. And I think one of the things that we did that we should be very proud of is the podcast that we did at the time, because I think we did manage to, I think we saw what we were trying to do is trying to explain the history, explain the context, and try to explain it from everybody's perspective, why each of the main players within this equation were all acting as they were. But I think since then, there's been so much that has happened. There have been so many difficult twists and turns, and you're right that the death and the destruction has been on a scale that I don't think any of us really quite predicted. You're talking about within Gaza a very large, substantial section of the population that now no longer lives where they were living before, on the move with nowhere to go. But I've been trying to get into the head of the Hamas people who launched this on October the 7th with the help of Iran. And Yahya Sinwar, the kind of leader, who is still at large, so far as the Israelis are concerned. And remember, Israel have said that sort of wiping out the Hamas leadership is the biggest thing that they want to do within Gaza. But the reason I think why we struggled at the time with why they would do this now is because we knew, and we actually said that day one, this is going to unleash absolute hell on the Palestinians. And if you think about it in relation to Iran and what Iran wants to do, Iran has a long-term goal of destroying the state of Israel. It has a long-term goal of wanting to dominate the Middle East, and it wants to be part of a new world order.
Can I question that a little bit?
Yeah.
I mean, we say that, but I think the Iranian story is much more complicated. For example, here's a question for you: what percent of GDP do you think Iran spends on defense?
A lot less than Israel.
Yeah, it spends about 2%. Spends about what the UK spends on defense. So almost half what the US would spend on its defense. You know, the US spend about 3.5.
Yeah.
Israel 5, Russia 7. To some extent, it's not a very militarized state. And this idea that actually what the Iranian regime exists for primarily is to dominate the Middle East is something that is said a great deal. But in fact, I don't think Iran poses exactly the kind of threat that people believe.
If you'd have not cut me off at the end of the second of my triptych,
yeah,
because the third part I was going to say was dominate the Middle East by being a significant part of a new world order that is not American dominated, but is dominated by China and Russia.
And I'm not even sure on that, because I think if you talk to the Iranian regime, they're pretty uncertain about what kind of relationship they want with China and Russia. They're pretty skeptical about those people as allies. To some extent, those countries are kind of feel, rightly or wrongly, as though they're being driven together by the way in which the world is developing. But there are many people, I think, in the Iranian regime who are very worried about being exploited by Russia or China and becoming too vulnerable to them. Just as there are many people in Russia very worried that actually the Chinese are basically ripping them off, getting oil cheap.
Yeah. They've been just take Russia though. They've been supportive on Ukraine. They had, in fact, one of the things that happened recently. I partly preparing for the podcast, I read, and because I knew we were going to talk about October the 7th, I've been reading the Tehran Times, whose slogan is "Straight Truth." And I was really shocked because the front page story started as follows: October 7 marks the anniversary of day one of the most devastating war against humanity ever launched. And I thought, my God, they're going to condemn Hamas. And he goes on to say, because a year ago, Israel began the massacre of Palestinians in Gaza through airstrikes, starvation and torture. The enclave now lies in ruins with approximately £45 million of rubble, scattered across the strip. Families have been wiped from the face of the earth, etc., etc., etc. So it almost like this front page story, Straight Truth, explains October the 7th without any context at all. And the other thing that I thought was really interesting in the same edition was a huge report of a meeting with the new president, Masoud Pezeshkian, with the Prime Minister of Russia, who obviously is not a big figure because Putin's a dictator, but the new Prime Minister, Mikhail Mishustin. And what was extraordinary, this is a meeting last week, it was all about working together on transport, energy, industry, agriculture, agreement to transform Iran into a regional gas hub, all this sort of stuff, and virtually no mention other than this. I'll read you the line. The Russian official underscored the necessity of deepening cooperation to establish a new world order that benefits all nations. He encouraged Iran and Russia to work closely together in light of escalating regional tensions, which he attributed to American policies that aim to exacerbate conflict for its own interests. They are very much part of that dialogue, that debate that says the old American-dominated order is not going to last in their view. Back to Hamas and why they did this last October the 7th. What I was told, or what was suggested to me, was that Hamas wants to accelerate Iran in its strategy vis-a-vis Israel, and that the best way to do that is to provoke Israel into the kind of action that we've seen since. You don't disagree? You don't agree?
I don't agree, no. I think that's the line that Netanyahu's government's trying to sell. I think the connections between Hamas and Iran are there, but they're relatively indirect. Despite really, really big attempts by the Israeli government and US intelligence to try to find a smoking gun linking the Hamas attack to Iran, they haven't managed to do that. It's true.
Do you think Hamas? I mean, I think we could argue pretty certainly that Hezbollah would have been able to launch that kind of operation. Do you think
Hezbollah, I mean, if Iran was looking to launch an assault, the obvious people to do it with was Hezbollah. Hezbollah, massive, much larger than Hamas, much more missiles. And so if they wanted to provoke a confrontation between Iran and Israel, they would have used Hezbollah. I mean, nobody's found evidence that this is what the Iranian leadership wanted Hamas to do.
No, my point is whether what the Iranian leadership is now doing is what Hamas wanted to happen. That's the point I'm making. And whether Israel's reaction, part of which you've just alluded to with the thing about Guterres and the way that they've approached the Americans, the way that they've launched a military operation without clear political objectives, the way that they've made no reference throughout, really, in any meaningful way, to a determination to prevent the loss of civilian life. Those figures that you talked about, I think something like 11,000 of those 42,000 are children. But that's not really been part of their approach. So my point is that it suited Hamas's purpose to have the reaction that they've had it. Now, by the way, I'm not making a kind of anti-Israel point there, because I think we can understand why Israel reacted as they did. My point is that over the year, Netanyahu's strategy, I think, and this is what was being said to me, has played into the hands of Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran.
I think I half agree. There's no doubt that Hamas did this with big political strategic things. I think the Iran part of the picture is much more muted. I think what Hamas was worried about was Israel was on a route to reconciliation and normalization of relationships, particularly with Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
And the situation's developed over the last 10, 15 years is that the Gulf states lost any interest in the Palestinian cause and began to become much more pragmatic about seeing Israel as a military and economic superpower and wanting, largely for economic reasons, to normalize. So you had UAE normalized with Israel and a lot of Israeli business and Emirati business going back and forth, and normalization with Sudan. And the big game in town was supposed to be Saudi. And so what Hamas did, I think you're right, is calculate that if they launched a horrifying attack across the border, and they must have known, even if it wasn't quite what they were expected. And I think one of the things that we've got to get to is that Hamas cannot possibly have expected to have been able to operate for that long on that border. I mean, because there's a huge story of Israeli failure of security, intelligence, and military, that it took them many, many hours to get to that border and deal with it. Roger Cohen in the New York Times yesterday was saying that in Israel at the moment, there's not a single hour on television where the Hamas massacre is not mentioned, with discussions from every angle and video clips at the moment.
And this is why Israelis are so upset, and close supporters of Israel in the UK and elsewhere are so upset at the way this debate has developed, because they are seeing that the whole time. They are constantly reminded this started on October the 7th. Whereas, and what the other point that Hamas were trying to do is almost like, and Hezbollah, is almost like create a kind of an equivalent of the situation for the Americans in relation to Vietnam, where America is drawn into a very clear, strong position pro-Israel, but then their own public, and we've seen this in the UK as well, that the public of those countries that are very pro-Israel, for us, the fact of October 7 gets played, recedes a little bit and is then dominated by the politics of this. The public are horrified at what their government is supporting, and I'd be interested to know whether the Roger Cohen piece, whether, for example, when they're covering what's happening in Gaza, is there the same focus in Israel on the deaths of civilians and women and children?
Absolutely not.
Probably not.
Absolutely not. I mean, if you watch Hebrew television, they basically don't cover Gaza at all. They only cover Gaza in terms of pictures of heroic soldiers. So what Hamas was calculating is that in the end, they believed that Israel's default response would be an incredibly aggressive militaristic security response. They calculated that Israel, and particularly Netanyahu government, had no interest in peace or a two-state solution. And therefore, all they needed to do was reveal that. So the way Hamas would talk about it is that they needed to reveal the true nature of the regime and the Netanyahu government. And Hezbollah, I think, didn't really want to be part of this fight. I mean, I think this is the other thing.
They were from day one, Rory. They said from day one that, I mean, okay, they weren't provoking the kind of conflict that we're having now, but from day one they were firing off rockets and basically saying, we're going to carry on doing this till Gaza's... But
right at the center of this is a very sensitive issue, which is this question of this word existential threat, which we bandy around all the time. And existential threat, just to take a second, literally means a threat to your survival, to your existence. If you're under existential threat, you cease to exist. It doesn't mean that people are threatening you, it means they're going to wipe you out. And the reason why we have to really interrogate the question of existential threat is obviously if you are going to be completely wiped out, and if it's likely you're going to be completely wiped out, then almost anything is justified, almost any risk is justified. But the problem is that our whole structure of politics is about the most pessimistic vision on the one hand, which is we're under an existential threat, and the most optimistic vision on the other hand, which is, and we're going to be able to sort it out. We're going to be able to cut the head off the Hydra. We're going to make sure that this never comes to get us again. So I'm going to do something which will make people very angry, which is I'm going to try to ask some of those questions in relation to what's happening in the Middle East, where we keep saying there's an existential threat, and therefore what we have to do is cut off the head of the Hydra. And I'm afraid that does remind me of Iraq, of Afghanistan, even though those situations are very different. And I absolutely accept that Israel is under threat in a way that the UK and the US were not under threat from Iraq and Afghanistan. Nevertheless, we still have to question what are the risks here, what are the costs here, what are the benefits. So this is very sensitive because this is right at the heart of the Israeli justification for what's happening at the moment, which is that they say that Hezbollah had mounted this incredibly aggressive attack on Israel, and Israel had no option other than to respond because missiles, thousands of missiles have been fired into northern Israel and 80,000 people have been displaced, and therefore it was necessary for them to do this. What the US and others have been saying for a year is completely different. Now, the US negotiators and everybody who's been trying to keep peace have been saying something else. What they've been saying is, no, wait a second. Hezbollah have over 100,000 precision missiles, which they could have been raining down on Tel Aviv. What they have done is felt that they were going to show solidarity and they were going to fire missiles to show that they were going to push for a ceasefire in Gaza. But these missiles have killed something in the region of 40 people.
Yeah.
They used very, very little of their arsenal. They didn't use their precision missiles. And why didn't they? They didn't because the US and other negotiators were saying, if you keep a lid on this and don't attack Israel too aggressively, we'll make sure Israel doesn't attack you. In a way, the problem in all of this is that Hamas is an unbelievably unpleasant organization. Hezbollah are an unbelievably horrifying organization. The Iranian regime is a horrifying and disgusting regime. And so that when Israel attacks Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran, obviously very few people are going to want to stand up for Hezbollah and Iran because these are horrible organizations. But that doesn't necessarily mean that Hezbollah and Iran, and this is, I'm now going to annoy a lot of people, pose an existential threat to the survival of Israel. Because then the question is, what type of existential threat? You know, and because what we've actually seen is that Hezbollah and Iran turned out to be able to inflict much, much less damage on Israel than people ever anticipated. And in fact, in a way, Israel knew that. The whole of Netanyahu's strategy in his attack on Hezbollah and Iran is predicated on the assumption that these people can't hit Israel that hard.
Okay, but when you were talking earlier about Hamas making a calculation, part of that calculation, I think, would have been that the Americans might have had some success at restraining the reaction to some extent, okay? But on the point about Iran, and the threat being existential or not, and there's no doubt, I think a lot of Israelis feel that it is existential.
Sure.
And if you think about the main pillars, the three pillars of their defense strategy vis-a-vis Israel are the development of nuclear weapons, advanced conventional weaponry, not least with the help of some of their friends, and also different bases in the region. So I think, put it this way, from an Israeli perspective, you can see why they might feel that this is an existential threat. The people I was talking to are by no means very supportive of the Netanyahu strategy. And the point they were making is that it was absolutely possible, had he wanted to, for Netanyahu to have held some of the moral high ground by being clear that they had absolute right to attack Hamas and other Iranian proxies, but that there would be real sympathy for the civilian population. And they could almost have said, we're going to take out Hamas, but actually, do you know what? That will help the people of Gaza. And I saw an opinion poll this week, Rory, where Hamas is not popular in Gaza right now because there is part of the blame going on them. And the next thing continued on building with the relations with the Saudis and others, and emphasized that long term there does have to be a plan for living in peace alongside each other. Instead of which, the sense has been that they're fighting a war not just against Hamas, but against Palestinians. And that's what has turned a lot of public opinion around the world. That's what's made life very, very difficult for Joe Biden. And of course, Netanyahu is we've said this many, many times, he has his own politics to deal with these right-wing extremists in his cabinet who don't want any of the stuff that I've just been talking about.
Yeah. So there's a couple of things here. I mean, I think the first thing is that you're right that Hamas is unpopular. You're right that Hezbollah is unpopular. And you're right the Iranian regime is unpopular. And most ordinary Iranians hate the fact that the regime has got involved in a fight with Israel. They just think it's completely irrelevant. I mean, most Iranians want to normalize, live a normal life, get on with their lives. And there's a sort of slight kind of delight in Iran at the moment when Israel hits the regime. And they sort of think, well, serves you right, you should never have got involved. And we don't really care about the Palestinian cause. And it's the same with Hezbollah. I mean, to some extent, Hezbollah was a Lebanese Shia organization whose core support came from getting rid of an Israeli occupation of southern Lebanon. It didn't have a particular natural affinity with the Palestinian cause. And that's been, it wasn't central to what Hezbollah was about. It was about Lebanon, it was about the Shia in Lebanon, and it was about the occupation of Lebanon. So there are many, many Shia in Lebanon also who think, oh my goodness, you know, Hezbollah got so dragged into solidarity with Palestine and fighting Israel that they've unleashed hell on us. So all that's true. The reason that I'm pushing on this existential thing is that it's really important because it's what drove Afghanistan and Iraq, where we also believed these places were an existential threat. And the reason it's difficult is that when you frame something as an existential threat to your survival, that then justifies you doing very, very aggressive things in order to neutralize that threat. The real question is what kind of threat do these kinds of terrorist organizations and proxies really pose? And that's a really horrible thing to ask, because it goes to the core of whether you can contain terrorist threats through counter-terrorist measures, security measures. If I'm being very, very blunt about it, what is the kind of threat that Hamas posed? What happened on October the 7th?
They're not the ones posing. They are part of the reason why Israel might fear an existential threat. The existential threat that Israel feels, though, is Iran.
Okay, so then to fast forward, we believed, obviously, that Afghanistan was an existential threat. We believed that Saddam Hussein was somehow an existential threat, and we had in our heads that he was going to fire missiles in 15 minutes.
Not in the same way. I don't think in the same way. No,
it's a very similar structure. I mean, this is why we got into this story about failure is not an option. We have to intervene. Okay, so so that then leads to the story that what needs to happen is the head of the Hydra needs to be cut off. Mm-hmm. So in the optimistic Netanyahu story, the idea is that somehow they launch strikes against Iran. And this is what his UN speech was about. Somehow the Iranian regime is kind of toppled, all the proxies disappear, and then Israel reconciles with the Gulf and a new democratic Iran. And you have this happy scenario that he showed on a piece of paper of a wonderful sort of gentle, constructive, democratic, pro-Israeli state. And that the way to get there is through attacking the Iranian regime. And that's where I see everything that we've seen over the last 20 years suggests that it just doesn't make any sense at all. And it seems to me that we have to look at 4 different scenarios. Either you hit the regime, and by hitting civilians as well, you make the regime stronger, increases support for the regime. Or secondly, you hit the military infrastructure regime, but you don't have much effect on its strength or weakness because it's hidden from the people. Or thirdly, you hit the regime in a way that weakens the regime, but it then feels more vulnerable and it lashes out. Or finally, you topple the regime through your strikes. And then the question is what comes after the regime safer for you or not? Because we've seen in Iraq, we've seen in Syria, we've seen in Egypt, we've seen in Libya, we've seen in Myanmar, many examples over the last 15, 20 years of situations in which regimes apparently toppling don't then lead to better outcomes. And in the case of Iran, I think you could imagine potential bad scenarios. It could be civil war, could be a military government taking over. And remember, although there is, of course, a very secular, liberal, internationalist group in Iran, there are obviously also supporters of the Revolutionary Guard and the Basij Militia and of the mullahs. So I think that's the other thing to ask. When we talk about cutting off the head of the Hydra, how do you cut off that head? And what does the Hydra do when somebody attacks its head?
So answer your own question. If you're Joe Biden or, heaven forfend, Donald Trump or Kamala Harris, and you have this sense that, and I think they do think there is an axis between the major, China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, that there is a kind of, even if not formal, there's a kind of axis going on there that is all about disrupting the world order dominated by the United States and rules and rule of law and all that stuff. How do they then deal with what they see as the malign intent of Iran? Now, it should be, I agree with you, it should be a combination of diplomacy and, always trying to keep contacts open to your enemy and alongside kind of strategic build-up and all that sort of stuff. But ultimately, the reason why I think this is maybe worth focusing upon for a bit is that you talked about the way that the situation is being covered in the Israeli media. I've been surprised talking to some Jewish friends who I think a year ago, And maybe we should get Yuval Noah Harari back on, because he was very interesting about this. He's somebody who cannot stand Netanyahu, like a lot of the Jewish friends that I know. And yet I think they feel more supportive of what the Israeli government is doing, in part because they have a sense that that support is weakening elsewhere. And they think it's weakening because we, the weak West, etc., we don't fully understand that the existential threat is exactly what they feel.
This is really tough. I mean, so of course Israel feels an existential threat. And many of them felt an existential threat on the October the 7th. And they felt that what Hamas did on October the 7th was a sign that unless they attacked Gaza, Hamas was going to wipe out every Israeli. And that in a way, that's kind of a little reminiscent of how we interpreted 9/11. What did 9/11 mean? I mean, there's no doubt that Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda was waging a global jihad, and they envisioned a world in which everybody was going to become a Muslim, and in which killing Christians and Jews was central to that project. So what sort of threat is this, and how do you respond to it? Now, and this is where I'm going to get a bit controversial, right? I think we made the wrong decision after 9/11. Mm-hmm. We concluded that what we needed to do is go after the head of the Hydra, and that was Osama bin Laden sitting in Afghanistan. And somehow if we got rid of him and toppled the Taliban government, we'd be safer. And we also thought if we got rid of Saddam Hussein, we'd be safer. And remember that many of the neocons and some politicians in Israel were also trying to make us go after Iran in 2002, 2003 for the same reasons.
Yeah.
Right. I remember when I was in Basra, people joking that I was put in as an acting governor of 2 provinces in southern Iraq. The sick joke at the time was that I needed to get my Farsi up and running again because I was going to be made to be the sort of acting governor of Isfahan. Right. The idea was that the neocons were going to roll into Iran. And the reasons for doing it were all these reasons. Iran is an existential threat to global security. There's an axis of evil. Iran is connected to North Korea and all these kind of things. And so what we need to do is topple the regime. And in those days, of course, we also understood that you can't just topple, because if you just topple, you leave anarchy and chaos behind. We have to topple a nation build.
But there's a very big difference with the current American administration. Joe Biden does not want this thing to escalate. And as all of his diplomacy and Antony Blinken's diplomacy as Secretary of State has been trying to de-escalate. That's the problem. That's the point I was making earlier, that these people that I've been talking to were basically saying the strategy that we've been trying to pursue has been kind of undone by the fact that Netanyahu has conducted his policy in a certain way that they think has made the likelihood of Iran getting more involved greater rather than lesser, and that is what Hamas wanted in the first place.
Yes, I think what Hamas really wanted wasn't Iran dragged in. What Hamas really wanted was to destroy the reconciliation with the Gulf, to make sure Israel didn't get to normalization with Saudi.
And just on that, Netanyahu could have, I know he's got a lot on his plate, it's incredibly difficult, but he could have said, and we're also going to continue with the attempts to normalize relations with other partners in the region. He could have done that. Instead of which the focus has been very, very much focused on the military, the idea of a military solution. I guess what we're arguing about is whether in these circumstances you put your main focus on security or on diplomacy. I guess that, and the truth is you have to do both, but it's how you get the balance right between that.
What's one of the really interesting things is that Iran has been exposed as much, much weaker than people thought. And Hezbollah has been exposed as much weaker. So Israel has realized that they've got Iran over a barrel. There's nothing Iran can really do to deter Israel. If they do nothing when Israel kills their diplomats in Damascus, kills Ismail Haniyeh in the organization in Tehran, then they fear Israel will be encouraged to do more. If, on the other hand, they respond and they send some missiles across, then Israel will say Iran is firing missiles at us. They're an existential threat. We got to wipe out Iran, right? So they've tried to find this very strange, insecure, narrow path of saying, well, we'll send a few missiles across, but we will warn people in advance before we fire the missiles. we'll only fire them at military targets, and we won't. Yeah. So we end up in a situation we don't kill many Israelis, and we hope that we can signal that we're doing something without doing so much that Israel can then get international support for attacking Iran. And the problem is that they're on a losing wicket because they're weaker, so much weaker militarily than Israel. I mean, Israel in the end has a nuclear bomb and Iran doesn't, right?
Yeah.
In the end, Israel will just keep upping the ante. They'll hit them again and again and again. And if Iran doesn't respond, it's screwed. And if it does respond, it's screwed. But then the question is, where does that end? And of course, the hope in Israel is that they can hit Iran so hard that somehow the threat of terrorist movements and states that are unfriendly to Israel will just disappear.
Yeah,
that's what it doesn't seem likely, because you can impose military damage on Iran, but in the end, the Palestinian problem remains, and the settlers remain, and the anger of the Palestinians remain. Gaza remains a weeping sore. There's a lot of Palestinians living in southern Lebanon, and there are many, many Muslims around the world, not just Muslims. I mean, a lot of young people around the world in all countries who are increasingly pro-Palestinian and anti-Israeli. I mean, in fact, and Israel is sort of benefiting in a way from an odd phenomenon, which is that the politicians around the world, particularly in the West, are strongly supportive of Israel, but most younger voters are increasingly not. But because the younger voters aren't organizing, I don't know whether this is about social media or about a new democratic landscape, or have lost faith in politics, there isn't a pressure from those younger voters somehow translating to the politicians to drive for ceasefires or peace.
Well, listen, we've no doubt both of us upset some people, but that's because it is such a difficult subject to talk about. But I think maybe close with this. I back in the 90s, when I was on the Mirror, I interviewed Yitzhak Rabin, who was the Israeli prime minister who was assassinated in the mid-90s by an extremist who was unhappy at him engaging in peace efforts. And I remember, it wasn't my interview, but a famous quote from Rabin. He said, "You don't make peace with friends, you make peace with enemies." And I think at some stage, that has to come back into the frame.
The big news in UK politics this week is that there has been a fundamental change at the heart of government. Sue Gray, who was Keir Starmer's chief of staff, has now basically been sacked or shoved sideways and replaced by a man called Morgan McSweeney. And this comes at a moment where it does feel that the Labour government hasn't really managed to impress. It hasn't really managed to get a sense of momentum, narrative, and part of that seems to be the story around the way in which Number 10 is run. What's your sense of what's going on there? And maybe we can get into the rights and wrongs of this.
As we normally do on our public appearances, we did a lot of show of hands at the Brighton for the first event of our tour. This is going out on Wednesday. We're in Birmingham this evening. And then we're going to Manchester, Glasgow, Cardiff, and terrifyingly the O2. But if you remember, I asked the audience, read the Labour government. Have they been as you expected them, better than you expected them, or worse than you expected them to be? And perhaps because it made you smile rather than me, perhaps you could give the result of that.
Well, it's fascinating, isn't it? So basically, people thought either as expected or worse than expected, but they also thought that Labour was likely to win the next election, which is a kind of sense of sort of.
But I think what's been going on I think the government started pretty well, and a combination of actually what we were talking about before, Gaza. I wouldn't underestimate, particularly young people, how much Gaza has really eaten into the sense of Labour not being a government of change. Then the winter fuel payment being taken, and then that allied to the whole sort of row about freebies, which we talked about on a recent podcast. We don't need to revisit that. But I think that has all come together with the Sue Gray story, which is, I feel a bit sorry for Sue, because the press have just been a bit obsessed about her, like they were at one point obsessed with me. She has got enemies. She's got enemies inside the civil service. She may also have enemies inside Labour. And I think it's unfair to blame any official, because ultimately the big point that I think has to emerge from this is the strategy that the government is pursuing has to become clearer, stronger. I've noted, I didn't realise that You may have read and heard, Rory, about this thing called the grid, which is something that we invented back in the 90s.
Yeah.
Sue Gray had control of the grid.
Yeah.
No, in our day,
tell us what the grid was. Yeah, exactly.
Well, the grid essentially, if you look at the grid, it's just you might think it's just a diary, but it's not a diary. It's a strategic tool. And actually, I think you can find them online. The examples, if you Google Downing Street grid and go into images, you can usually see some of them. And essentially, so let's just take, for example, we said on the podcast, and we said in Brighton, that I think one of the missteps has been to have this near 4-month gap between the election and the budget. But let's take the budget. You know when the budget's going to be. So there in your grid, well in advance, you say budget day. Okay? And then you know that out of the budget, there are going to be a number of announcements, big debates, big arguments, and you plan around them following the budget. But you also seed the ground for the arguments ahead of the budget.
So let's say you were thinking that what you were going to have to do is borrow some more money in order to spend some more money on the NHS, and that was going to be revealed in the budget. How would you set about sort of preparing those things that you just mentioned?
If you remember, I'll answer that very specifically. There was a point where we did want to spend more money on the health service. And Gordon Brown laid the ground. Gordon was very, very good at commissioning reports and then getting those reports to say that this is what should be done, and then he would do it. And that was really the notion of a hypothecated tax. You float the idea of a hypothecated tax. You put 1 penny on the national insurance, and that goes to the health service. I'll give you another example more recently, the winter fuel thing. You could have made a speech early in the government to say, yes, we've got this black hole, we're going to have to make some difficult choices. Today I'm going to focus on pensions and pensioners. And you set out a big argument about how pensioner wealth has increased, but so has pensioner poverty. And therefore, there may be a case to look at whether all of the benefits that all pensioners get, whether some of them in the state pension is secure and there's triple lock, etc. You float the argument. You get others to float the argument. But the other thing that the grid does is that when I say it's a strategic tool, when I looked at the grid, and it's basically sort of the main thing that you want to communicate on a particular day is at the top, the second thing second, and then everything else is below. So, for example, November the 5th, the top of the grid in any government, most governments in the world, is going to be the American election because that's where the world's eyes are going to be focused. But you might around that say, well, the Foreign Secretary 2 days before will make a big speech setting out the British interest insofar as the outcome is concerned. We have to make relations with both, et cetera, et cetera. So you plan it like that. But the thing I always used to say when I looked at the grid, and I had a guy whose job, his total full-time job was I saw him as my air traffic controller because he was bringing in all the different things happening in government. He had people in every government department that he liaised with. He met with them once a week. And he then prepared notes on everything that they were doing. And then he would map it out. And then we would say, yeah, okay, good, that we move that. And every time I looked at the grid at the weekend, and I accompanied it with a note to every cabinet minister, every private sector, every comms director, this is what we're doing next week vis-a-vis strategy, does everything that's at the top of that grid speak to one of our strategic priorities?
Got you. So let's say so maybe the theme for the week was, I don't know, early childhood education. And you'd want basically that week was going to focus on that. And you wouldn't want ministers out talking about stuff that had absolutely nothing to do with that or launching huge initiatives that confuse that message. You'd want to try to reinforce
I don't know whether you do it. I think for something to take over a whole week, it would have to be like the budget. It would have to be like the budget.
Okay.
But you would certainly have, for example, let's take a smaller example. We're recording this on the day that there's been this report by the Commission on Oracy. Okay. So that's a report that's been an outside body has done. So that might be a third order thing on the grid, but you plan for that, so you know that's coming. And you say, okay, what's Bridget Phillipson doing on that day? Is it worth her doing a visit that accompanies this? Is it worth getting her on the media round? Is it worth targeting the daytime media because that's maybe more of an issue for that? So you plan around them.
Do you have someone in your head? I want the front page of the paper ideally to focus on this story, and then I want Oracy sort of back at page 5. So maybe you might have 3 or 4 stories.
This may surprise you. I never really worried about. I worried less about the immediate outcome than about the impact within and upon government. Part of what this is internal communications, is that everybody knows what everybody else is doing and everybody knows why they're doing it. So we had, if you think about when we got elected, modernisation. You see, we've had modernisation going through everything. Many, not the few, future, not the past, leadership, not drift, education, the number one priority. So if you say education, the number one priority, you better make sure there is something every single week that speaks to education. If you're saying future, not the past, don't make lots of, weird and wonderful speeches about nostalgia. Make speeches about the future. So that's why I say it's a strategic tool. And I think what's happened since the election is actually the grid has become more a diary. And that's why I said, okay, well, on Tuesday we're doing the Chagos Islands, and then on Wednesday we're having a big reshuffle inside Downing Street or whatever it might be. Well, how does that hang together?
And is this partly that by personality, maybe Keir Starmer, Sue Gray are sort of civil servants? I mean, and Rachel Reeves, they were all civil servants, weren't they? So maybe civil servants tend to have a more, we're doing all this complicated stuff in government, we're just getting on with it day to day. And actually what you're lacking is the sort of experienced politicians who are doing something civil servants don't often have to do, which is kind of lay out big, simple, primary color narratives. Because, of course, presumably if you're a civil servant, you say, modernization, education, and the initial response is, well, yeah, but, quite a lot of what we're doing is about the past, or a lot of things we're doing is not about education.
Yeah, sure.
Right? Yeah,
sure. By the way, and there's no harm in having that. That's why ultimately, I did an interview with Andrew Marr on LBC last night. And he said, how big a change to the government do you think it will be that Morgan McSweeney is now the chief of staff rather than Sue Gray? And I said, well, actually, the answer to that should not be about Morgan McSweeney or Sue Gray. It's about Keir Starmer. What does Keir Starmer want the government to be? What does Keir Starmer want the government to do? And strategy and message has to come from the top. Then you have to have these systems that I'm talking about to make sure that it's properly coordinated and properly communicated. And that's the bit that I hope this reset will do. And actually, I thought it got far less attention for obvious reasons, because then the media is a bit obsessed with Sue Gray. Added to which, by the way, I think there's an element of misogyny to that. But anyway, but I think the other interesting point was this guy, James Lyons, who was a journalist, then worked for the NHS, now at TikTok, who's coming in to do strategic communications. All that strategic communications is the communication of a strategy at the same time as you're devising and implementing that strategy. That's all that it is. And the grid and the openness and explanation. I was doing an event this morning talking to these people they were business people, but they were kind of confused about what the government's about. And I said, well, I hope that this reset will actually fix some of that, because what we've lost, I think, and this isn't just a Labour thing, I think we've lost this from our politics generally, is that kind of educative, explanatory stuff about why we're doing something, what is happening in the world that makes this relevant. And you can build blocks around that. You don't just think of one event. There's no such thing as one event. They've got to tie together in some way. And sometimes you have to force it. You have to say, okay, well, I can see why you don't think that's got much to do with that, but I'm going to make a link so that I can emphasize part of the strategic message that we're trying to deliver.
Well, I had a long chat with George Osborne today. Spent an hour chatting to George Osborne about this. And he said that it was much clearer with Blair and Brown what they were up to. And to some extent, Brown had a lot of ideas and had a very talented team. He had Ed Balls, Nev Miliband, and Douglas Alexander, as we talked about, generating ideas, even if that was sometimes a bit frustrating. And that the Tories, when they came in 2010, I remember this, in the lead up to the 2010 election, there were these big policy groups, sometimes connected with your dreaded Tufton Street think tanks, but really generating stuff. So, some of it very controversial. That's the universal credit stuff came out of the Centre for Social Justice. Gove's education policy, which was supposed to be learning from Scandinavia and the United States. There was Andrew Lansley's dreaded health reforms. And above all, there was this story that they'd told in the election, which is the fundamental problem with Labour. And again, it doesn't matter if it's true or not, but it was a narrative that was very easily understood. Fundamental problem with Labour is they've spent too much. So if you vote for us, we're going to cut spending. So everyone knew what they were on about. And of course, I think what George is pointing to here is we don't really know what the analysis is. I mean, I've talked about one problem, which is that not very long ago, like a year and a half ago, the normal story I would have got out of you or people who are broadly sympathetic to Labour is that the problem with the Tories was austerity. The problem was they cut too much, right? And that the solution was that they needed to spend more. And if you spent more, actually, the economy would grow. And this is kind of the Marianne Mazzucato and idea that if you put investment in the right place, and it grows, right? But that narrative got a bit lost because we then suddenly had Rachel Reeves going into an election saying she was not going to spend more, she wasn't going to raise more. And actually, when she got in, she changed the story from the problem is that the Tories have cut too much to the problem is that the Tories have made a whole series of unfunded spending commitments. In other words, the Tories are spending too much. I saw that as one big problem. I mean, what's your view on what the Starmer vision is, or the Morgan McSweeney vision, and what are they going to try to tell us? If your thing was education, what's their thing? What's their, or Osborne was austerity?
Yeah, our thing wasn't education. Our thing was modernisation, and education was a key priority within that. So modernize. I think what they would say is that it's about building an economy where people have genuine equality of opportunity, and I guess it's levelling up. It is actually levelling up. But again, to do that, Liam Byrne, former chief secretary, famously with his letter.
Sorry, there's no cash.
Yeah, exactly. And I'll send on to you this thing that he's written. Maybe we should talk about it next week, because he's basically an analysis of where reform did well against Labour. And people think it's all about immigration, but actually there's an almost exact correlation between where people's living standards were falling further behind those who had rising living standards, which is a lot of us. And so I'll send it to you. It's very, very long and detailed, but it's really worth reading. So I think it is about levelling up. It is about extending opportunity and equality. And the key to it is growth. There's no doubt about that. But so, for example, their missions, if I was doing their strategic communications, I would build them all around the 5 missions. That's what they've been elected on.
Yeah. What are the 5 missions again?
That.
What are the missions? Yeah.
Growth. Yeah. There's a growth mission. There's a green mission. There's a health mission. There's a crime mission. There's an aspiration mission.
Gotcha. Okay.
So, and by now,
is that not too many missions?
Well, if it is, make it all about growth and say that there's flow from it. But at least have clarity and priority.
There are basically 5 things that you could have said about Britain. You could have taken the Blairite view. So I think the Tony Blair Institute actually provided a very, very coherent vision of what Tony Blair would be doing if he was Prime Minister. And that's a lot of focus on technology and openness and globalization, which I think Morgan McSweeney doesn't like. Right? The second view was the kind of Corbyn view, and which was to some extent early Starmer. When Starmer ran for election, it was tax the rich, abolish universal credit, scrap tuition fees, bring in free movement, lead a green revolution. The third one was, which we thought in the run-up to the election was their shtick, which I think you were sort of selling me on, which is that they're just more serious and competent. We're fed up with these jokers and we're just going to get in a more serious, competent government. And there's a lot of low-hanging fruit.
Which is not enough, by the way. That gets you through the door, but it's not enough.
The fourth one, I think, is the really radical one, which is the kind of Labour equivalent of Thatcher, who really tries to rip stuff up and do things in a completely different way. And that, for example, in planning, we've had all this stuff on how our roads cost twice as much to build as they do in France. And we've just spent £200 million just on the planning process for the Thames Tunnel. So maybe there would be a vision of Labour just coming up and saying the number one problem in Britain is infrastructure housing planning. And we're going to go to war. We're going to go to war with NIMBYs in Tory housing estates, and we're going to rip up a lot of the regulations. We're going to challenge even the environmental lobby to get the stuff built. And then the final one, I think, is the one that you're sort of getting to, which is this sort of Morgan McSweeney vision, which is levelling up, sometimes called security, sometimes kind of dealing with shabbiness, and which feels sometimes a little bit like the eyesore gardens policy. And the sense that Morgan McSweeney hated Corbyn, but also doesn't really like the Blairite vision. He's not really into globalization, technology, centrism, no more left and right. It's very much, we're going to make things better for working class communities, isn't it? Yeah.
My point is that we shouldn't really be talking about what he thinks, because the big vision and the big drive and the big strategy has to be about the politicians, and it has to be about the Prime Minister in particular. So there's no doubt. Obviously, you know, I know this when part of Tony Blair's strength, I think, was that he surrounded himself with a collection of people, different backgrounds, different views, different sort of assessments, different skills, but we all worked together to help him. What we didn't do was like say, okay, I mean, if we did have, I would happily, Rory, have sat in Downing Street and said, right, next up, we're going to get rid of private education. Next up, we're going to lower the voting age. Next up, we're going to bring in compulsory voting. I never did that. I argued things that I believed in, but ultimately he was the boss. And I think it would be dangerous, given him, you know, one of Jonathan Powell, who was our chief of staff, one of his great strengths, I helped him in this by being such a lightning rod. Jonathan very rarely got written about. Jonathan just got on with his job, and he was absolutely brilliant at it, okay? Didn't want profile, didn't want publicity, got very annoyed when it happened.
What was his job? I know we're coming to the end, but just what is this chief of staff job if it's done well? Because you've got a cabinet secretary, you've got a principal private secretary who doesn't exist at the moment, but in your case was John Holmes. No, they've
just been appointed, yeah.
Right, so you had John Holmes and you had Robin Butler, is that right? When he first came in, yeah.
Well, we had several private secretaries. Yeah. We had Alex Allen, we also had Robin Butler, and we had Jonathan. And essentially, they had to work together, but all of them were facilitating. Jonathan, with particular using the Prime Minister's perspective, facilitating what he wanted and what the government was trying to do. Simple as that. And that really does mean that the people who are doing those jobs really, really matters. But so if I was, and I think Morgan's canny enough to know this, he's going to get written about quite a lot, and he'll get written about particularly in the coming days and weeks. He should try and keep his head down in terms of that. This should be about Keir Starmer having a project, not Morgan McSweeney having a project. Right. Now, Rory, we've gone on for a long time. We can't leave people hanging about what we discovered in Brighton, can we? So there we were at Brighton, between 3,000 and 4,000 people. Yep. And we asked them if they were Tories, and some of them were. There was a guy in the front row with a beard who admitted to me he was a member of the Tory party. Which is, you know, fair play. Alongside two people, let me just tell our listeners this, two people who had been to the Brighton-Tottenham game. They were sitting in the front row wearing Tottenham shirts. And Rory said to them at one point, I mean, take those two Arsenal fans there. Any idea how bad that is, Rory? Anyway, why don't you reveal what the answer was to the question about who they would vote for if they were Tories? And second question, who they would fear the most if they were Keir Starmer?
Well, so the overwhelming vote was for James Cleverly, and I told counts. Yeah, and I told James Cleverly this, and he texted back saying, "Great, because I'm really going to win this on the basis of the Brighton Book Club."
Yeah, but you know, it's interesting because that does show, I think, maybe the difference between. It was a very general audience. I mean, there were. I'm guessing most of them were left of centre, but there were lots of people there. It was a pretty middle class audience. I suspect there'd be more Tories there than we think. They didn't necessarily want to put their hands up in front of me.
I mean, I think if you were Cleverly, what you'd say is that this confirms what he would want to say, which is that he is more popular with the general population and is more likely to be able to take the fight to Starmer. But the problem is that even making it to the final two relies on MPs, and then becoming leader relies on this tiny number of elderly right-wing Conservative Party members, just over 100,000 of them. And so the question is, I mean, I think that's what Cleverly's slightly making a joke with when he's texting me back, that is he going to be able to let the Conservative Party in the country sense that he does have an appeal with the general public? Or are they just going to try to get back into their comfort zone by going for sort of right-wing identity politics and finding themselves. And of course, the reason I think that would be so stupid of the Conservative Party is that it's the one thing that will give purpose back to Keir Starmer. Keir Starmer won this election basically because people were fed up with the Tories and thought they were slightly crazy and didn't know what they were doing and incompetent. So given that Keir Starmer so far hasn't managed to make it clear which of these kind of 5 visions the country's got, what he can do is, if he ends up with Robert Jenrick or Kemi Badenoch, say, I'm here to stop these guys. Look at these guys across the dispatch box. These are proper dangerous people. You're going to prefer me because I am, more moderate, more thoughtful, more normal than this lot. And whereas James Cleverly is a kind of jujitsu, because if Cleverly comes in and doesn't sound particularly extreme, sounds rather sort of moderate and kind of reasonable and normal, then Keir Starmer's got a bit of a problem because it's much less easy to define himself.
I've got to say, God, he's got a bit of a cheek with his response on the Chagos Islands.
What's he done on the Chagos Islands?
Well, he basically was in charge of the negotiations to get this thing sorted out in government, and the Labour government had been full of praise for the work that he did. And then as soon as the deal gets concluded, he comes out and says, it's terrible that we're giving these islands away.
Just quickly, before we end, that Brighton show was really fun. As you say, almost 4,000 people, great questions, great interaction. We're now rolling on to Birmingham.
Tonight.
O2, which I'm really looking forward to. We're doing Glasgow, we're doing Cardiff. And it's Manchester twice.
Don't forget Manchester.
Don't forget Manchester twice. And I'm really loving these live shows. So thank you for everybody who came, and let's get them in. And O2, the numbers are absolutely crazy, and we're doing it in the round like a boxing match. So let's see how that.
And one of the questions indeed was who would win a fight.
Yeah, and the answer was I conceded it would be you, unless I could tire you out somehow by running around the stage for long enough. Right. Okay. Thank you, Alastair. See you soon. Bye-bye.